Thank you to the Center for Women's Global Leadership and Radhika in particular for inviting me to this absolutely wonderful symposium. I am learning so much and meeting wonderful people. So I'm going to be talking about financialization and austerity in particular, and I'm going to explain what financialization means as well in just a second. But I want to preface with saying that there are very well-designed and well-orchestrated, deeply embedded technical systems that underpin poverty and inequality, that drive poverty and inequality on a systemic level. By this I mean that there are ways in which the systems in place create, maintain, and perpetuate many of the things that we've heard about today, from patriarchy to racism to inequalities and marginalization, and the asymmetry and imbalance of North and South. Now, we're in a context today where we're seeing multiple intersecting and interdependent crises, right? We're seeing a crisis of finance and economy kicked off by 2007. We're seeing that of climate change and the environment, which many of us know about, with natural resources depleting, climate change on the horizon. Is this working? Okay. And we're also very particularly seeing a crisis of food security. Basic food staples and commodities have become the newest grounds for financial gambling in the international markets. These global crises are underpinned by a crisis of governance. There are international institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, global bodies such as the G20 and G8. There are abstract banking supervision bodies such as the Bank for International Settlements based in Switzerland. And there is the OECD and the Paris Club, which is the club of the richest 8 countries, the US and Europe. Why does this matter for human rights? The basic economic and social and cultural rights of people around the world are structurally impacted by the current international financial and macroeconomic architecture. We can think of this architecture, when I say architecture, you can imagine a constellation of systems. Like, for example, imagine a picture of planetarium, stars and orbits. You've got, one constellation of stars here, one there, but they all work in cohesion with each other. And they perpetuate economic and social injustice together. So when we're looking at the impacts of financialization austerity, many voices are raising red alarms these days, such as a lost decade for the world economy that risks development gains that have been made over the last 10 years or even more, and throws into question the ability of governments to tackle the most urgent challenges of our age. So what is financialization? It's essentially an explosion in derivatives trading and speculative financial markets. What this means, derivatives, first of all, are financial instruments that are traded in the markets. Their prices are derived from the value of other financial instruments. So you can have financial prices of stocks and bonds and commodities, currencies, interest rates. And then they make a price based on that, which involves hedging against risk. So when we say speculation, we mean that more and more of the financial activity happening around the world is based on essentially an act of gambling, an act of guessing on the price. Today, the derivatives trading globally has a size of $648 trillion. This was the figure most recently in December 2012, which is actually a decrease from before the financial crisis. Again, that's $648 trillion. The currency market alone is reported to trade $4.7 trillion a day, which is the biggest in the financial system, and as critics have pointed out, a market that embodies all the hallmarks of a casino. What we're looking at today is a financial economy that's over 60 times bigger than the real economy. So this economy, where investors around the world, firms, banks, are gambling, literally gambling, trading financial instruments, betting on the price of currencies, betting on the prices of food, betting on the prices of stocks, is more than 60 times bigger than the real economy. When we say real economy, what do we mean? The real economy of production, direct investments, jobs, wages, things you can touch, real people, the world as we see it physically. But there's a bubble world over it, which is vastly larger. Now, why does this matter, right? Why does this matter? Because the financial economy has created its own bubble, which is disconnected. If it was actually connected to the real economy, in basic development economics theory, we would see that the financial economy is the servant of the real economy, that it serves the needs of production, investments, jobs, and wages, in that it provides capital, it provides investments. But we're seeing the opposite today. We're seeing a complete disconnection, where because of this disconnection, you have all sorts of dangerous developments. The volatility, the way the prices move up and down of currencies and food and commodities like oil. You have panic exits of capital. You have money that leaves developing countries overnight because of a certain drop in the bond price or their interest rates. You have a lack of access to credit and financing for the real economy, and this impacts the most vulnerable in the world the most. And by saying the most vulnerable, I mean specifically women in the rural areas of developing countries, especially the least developed countries. Rural women face the most hardship because they really have no access to financial services, to credit, to a bank account. So this huge mushrooming of the financial economy is a new thing. It's really taken place over the last several decades. It didn't exist in the 1970s. In the 1980s, it was barely starting. It's about 20 to 25 years old, and that's why it's such a phenomenon. And in this rise of the financial economy, we've seen recurrent crises happening. If we look back at just 1997-98, we see the Asian financial crisis, 2001, crises in Brazil and Argentina and Russia, and there's been recurrent crises. People say it's a boom-bust global economy due to financialization. But it's based on a structural shift from the real economy of jobs, wages, income, production, factories, to the financial economy, right? Just as we saw a shift from manufacturing to services, this is a shift on a different level, because services you can at least touch and see the real people to some degree. This financial economy is not even about real people. It's not even about real money. It's bubbles upon bubbles, and we saw the impacts of it clearly in 2007. One of the most worrying parts of this bubble world we now find ourselves in is with regard to the food crisis. Food is one of the essential human rights. The ability to access food. It's an economic right, it's a social right, it's one of the indivisible human rights. And what we have today is food protests that have erupted all over the world, from Algeria, Bangladesh, Egypt, India, Iraq, Jordan, Mozambique, Morocco, Nigeria, Senegal, Syria, Tunisia, Uganda, Yemen, and these are just a few countries. Why is there why has there been the spike in food protests? Well, companies like Monsanto, like big agricultural industrial firms, have existed for a long time. These protests have happened in the last couple of years specifically. So if we look at just the last couple of years, what's happened to food? Food prices have increased by 200% in countries like Zimbabwe. The price of maize, a food staple. When the price of a food staple goes up 200% over the course of a couple of days, there's going to be food riots. One of the reasons this has been happening is something called food futures. So the derivative that I explained a while ago, There are derivatives that are based on food prices, and financial markets actually trade basic food staples such as maize, such as soy, such as cocoa, such as rice, such as potatoes. In countries like India, for example, even onions, potatoes, and tomatoes are traded financially. So when food futures are based on price estimates that are not consistent with the actual agricultural market for the food, you have massive food price increases that don't match up with the actual agricultural reality of that food. So this is one of the ways in which you can really connect financialization to human rights. Another thing that's been going on vis-a-vis financialization is something called quantitative easing. It may sound a little bit technical, but quantitative easing is basically what when quantitative easing has been happening with the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is the U.S. central bank, printing money. It prints money and then it sends it off into equity and bond markets or the financial markets of developing countries, right? The Federal Reserve has been saying for the most part that we're printing money to help stimulate the economy. But unfortunately, the documents, the data shows that most of the money the Federal Reserve has been printing, which is exactly the tune of $85 billion every month, that money is primarily going into developing country economies. Now, why is it going to developing countries? Because in the last couple of years, the interest rates of developed countries, such as the US and the Eurozone countries, have been at record historical lows. So there's no profits to be made in the US and Europe. So that's why it goes to developing countries, because the stocks and the commodities of developing countries are making the global financial investors a lot of money. So what happened recently is that the Federal Reserve Chairman said that the Federal Reserve would be tapering off this $85 billion a month of printing the U.S. of U.S. dollar printing. As soon as he said that, literally as soon as he said that, within hours, there was a chain reaction globally. There was a chain reaction globally where the U.S. interest rates started going up, and the money that was flowing into developing countries started flooding out. So countries such as India saw its rupee, its national currency, fall from 56 to 68 to the US dollar, literally overnight. Indonesia saw its rupiah fall from 9,500 to 11,000, literally overnight. When these national currencies fall in value, within a couple of nights, within a couple of days, you have massive impacts on the local economy. The local economy goes in a downward spiral tailspin. So these ways in which the financial markets and financial institutions, such as the Federal Reserve, in the most powerful countries in the world, impact the rest of the countries inordinately. It is an amazing amount of impact that the financial markets have around the world. And these are completely undemocratic financial markets. When have we ever heard that a financial market has even heard of human rights, let alone is accountable to human rights and the impacts of its actions, and not just its policies, but its day-to-day actions on the people around the world, and not just people in developing countries. I point that out as an example because it's the most severe in developing countries, but people in the U.S. as well, as we know, with the 2007 subprime mortgage crisis and all the American citizens that have lost their homes and continue to lose their homes. So this is the part about financialization. I'm going to touch on austerity very quickly before wrapping up. So this was one part of my presentation which I wanted to look at financialization and financial markets, but intimately connected to financialization is austerity policies. By austerity policies, we basically see what's happening around the world today. In fact, we say it's an age of austerity, where we have a recent report that looks at 181 countries. And the report concludes by saying that austerity policies, in terms of budget cuts, in terms of the shrinking of money that circulates in the economy, in terms of subsidies that are given out, especially for social safety social safety net programs, and in particular in terms of social security, like pension funds. And the social security and health systems here. So in terms of what we're seeing in these austerity policies, which is basically an aggressive and vicious cutback of social spending for development, we are looking at figures such as in 2013, austerity policies will impact 5.8 billion people, or 80% of the global population. In 2015, in less than 2 years, this is expected to increase to 6.3 billion, or 90% of our human population. So austerity is not just a wave, it's not just a trend. It has long-term impacts. In countries such as Greece, where you have education and health sectors being stripped away, when even in this country, it's all on the chopping block, social security, you have long-term impacts. This isn't just one child missing out on a couple years of school. This is that couple of years of school translating into lifelong impacts, maybe not re-entering school, long-term joblessness. And, we see headlines in Greece today where depression rates and suicide rates have skyrocketed just in the last 2 years. So this is a huge, huge crisis we have today, which is the crisis of austerity. So one of the things about austerity that's important to note is that while a lot of the attention is placed on the austerity measures in Europe, it's actually the degree to which public spending is being cut is the sharpest in developing countries. We see in developing countries, 25% of the countries surveyed out of 180 actually have cuts that are deeper than 2007. So what this means is that there was some sort of rationalization that, because of the crisis, you have to cut public spending because there's all these big deficits and debt levels all over the world. But that cutting was supposed to be proportionate to the impacts of the 2007 financial crisis. What's actually happened is even deeper cuts than before, which actually leads to one of the sort of perspectives that, this was the conservative agenda from the very beginning, and that the financial crisis provided an opportunity to implement the policies that they wanted to anyhow. So this is this is again debatable. I wanted to highlight the role of the International Monetary Fund. There have been various reports over the last several years where when countries take out financial loans from the International Monetary Fund, there are certain conditions that these loans come with. Some of these conditions are, for example, like getting rid of or reducing subsidies, especially on food and agriculture. This is taking place today in 100 countries. Another conditionality is cutting the wage bill. So what that means is that you reduce the salaries of public sector workers. In most countries, public sector workers include teachers, doctors, and nurses. So the essential social sectors, the core social fabric, education, and health are debilitated, are crippled. This is happening in 98 countries where the education and health employees are having their salaries cut. And there's also other reforms such as, labor flexibilization, which leads to, not being pro-labor unions and hiring and firing more easily. So there's a lot of issues with the way in which the ideology of austerity has developed, the rationalizations of this kind of cutting back of public spending. We see historically that austerity is very counterproductive. It results in a downward plunge of economic production, revenues, investments, growth, jobs, and societal well-being. It's actually the opposite, called expansionary policies, expansionary budget policies, where you channel and push money into the social sectors, into creating jobs, into providing incentives for local economic actors to create more jobs that can actually bring an economy back up on its feet. So what we're having right now in austerity is not just that it's unjust and a violation of economic and social and human rights, but that it is the flip opposite of what actually brings an economy to recovery. I just wanted to wrap up now with just a few words about why it's important for youth to take action. We've seen Occupy in the US. We've seen youth movements in Greece. In Egypt, there's a youth campaign called the Popular Campaign to Drop Egypt's Debt. In Tunisia, university students have come together to form the Tunisian Debt Audit Campaign, where they want to check the debt of the former dictatorship. You see youth movements in Brazil and in Turkey. They've been protesting in the park. These social movements must be sustained. We can't look at it as, oh, we were out there and nothing happened. Let's look at the US civil rights movement as an example. How many decades do movements take? How much persistence? How much patience? We need to keep a long view in terms of the long arc of demanding change. And I also wanted to make a plea with regards to cultural consciousness, that we need a deeper cultural consciousness to shift towards standing up to politicians, and not just politicians, but to the global financial sector, to demand, not to assert, not to ask, but to demand our economic and social rights, to demand the salvaging of the social contract between the state and her people, and to call for structural transformation of these financial systems that entrench poverty, inequality, racism, and sexism. Thanks.
Thank you, Bhumika, for sharing with us information on financialization, including its architecture, as well as the effects in terms of the austerity measures which governments are instituting and have instituted, and what that means for human rights already gained, specifically with relation to social protection measures, access to water, healthcare, education, and the challenges that leaves us in terms of moving forward. I'd like now to introduce Ajim DK. Ajim is the Executive Director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, and she will speak with us today about the human rights movements and the need for human rights movements in the U.S. to address issues of poverty and inequality. Ajim.
Thank you, Savi. Can people hear me? Yes? Okay. All right. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon?
Good afternoon.
I'm just trying to wake you up. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and have had long time respect and love the folk at the Center for Women's Global Leadership. So I'm honored to be here. And I was thinking, as I was listening to Bhumika speak about how much more informed I feel after the morning and then her presentation, and how much smarter I feel. I think I'm going to drop words like quantitative easing in my next conversation. Anyway, I work with the U.S. Human Rights Network. For those of you who don't know, the U.S. Human Rights Network is a network of organizations and individuals working to strengthen a human rights movement and a human rights culture within the United States. And in particular, human rights movement at the grassroots level, led by people who are most directly impacted by human rights violations, a people-centered human rights movement. And we've been around for 10 years. In fact, we celebrate our 10th anniversary this year. So my presentation is going to be slightly shifting from the focus from the morning and the afternoon, because I am going to be talking almost exclusively about the United States, and I feel almost shamefaced about that. But our work focuses on human rights in the United States, and we do so because often that's not what's thought about. In fact, one of the two most frequent responses or reactions I get when I tell someone I'm a human rights activist is they ask questions about international human rights violations, or, and this is happening more in the South, they ask me questions about human trafficking. Now, don't get me wrong, gross human rights violations are happening all over the world, and human trafficking, labor and sex trafficking are gross human rights violations, so I don't say that to diminish that. What I am saying is that there are a whole lot of other human rights concerns that we should be talking about, and a lot of them, human rights violations happening right here in the United States. So we really focus on these human rights violations, the full range of trying to realize a full range of human rights, because they're linked mostly to poverty and inequality, and then affect a whole range of other issues in our lives. So your access to income affects your ability to access safe housing in this country, whether or not you get a quality education. And it makes it much more likely that you'll get the death sentence if you should ever find yourself in that position. So actually, a lack of income, poverty, and all that's linked to inequality have a lot to do with almost every sphere of one's life. And of course, who's most vulnerable when we talk about these things? Women, children, people of color. And that compounded with whether or not your sexuality, your gender identity, whether you have a disability, your immigration status, you name it. So we focus a lot of our work on emphasizing the full range of human rights issues that exist in the United States. And I would say that we actually have a particular emphasis on economic and social and cultural rights, precisely because in the United States, the US Constitution does not recognize these as human rights, as rights. And in addition, quite frankly, in a lot of the American psyche, there's no thinking, there's no understanding of economic and social rights as full-fledged human rights. So we pay a little more attention to those issues so we can raise awareness. So let's see. I wanted to start by sharing something I observed actually 3 days ago. I went to, as many of you may know, the UN high-level dialogue on migration and development is happening as we speak. And in conjunction, there's the People's Global Action for Migration, Development, and Human Rights, which is a civil society gathering that happens at the same time, taking advantage of the fact that people will be here and really an alternative, a human rights alternative to the discussions taking place. So I went to the opening session, and there was a report back from all the regions in the world. Every region came to they'd had discussions, participatory discussions, and they were there to share feedback for how things they thought governments needed to include in the discussion in order to have realize human rights in discussing migration, and development. And 3 things struck me, or I should say 3 themes came up. The first was that almost every region of the world called for an end to neoliberal economic policies, okay? And we heard that today, huh? The second is that every region in the world also called for an end to the criminalization of migrants. Now, this is focused on migrants, remember. And then the third was everyone also recognized the need to build a movement in order to realize human rights for all. And I share these because it struck me that those 3 lessons would be a useful way to talk about poverty and inequality globally, but also in the United States. So I wanted to focus my conversation or my comments around those three themes. I'll start off by saying that there are about 46 million people in the United States living in poverty, most of them women and children. And that's a very conservative number, because the way we define poverty is actually not poverty in real life. The federal poverty measure, I don't remember the numbers and it's not important right now, but it's much lower than it actually is in real life. In other words, if you are earning minimum wage in this country, you are still making, and if you're earning a minimum wage in this country and you're working full time and you have a child, you're still living in poverty in this country. And that does not mean that you can meet, let's say you made $10,000 over that. That does not mean that that it's a living wage. That's what I'm trying to say. So clearly, we have a poverty problem in the world's richest economy. I think it still is. And then we've seen, as most people know, no news, the highest increase in inequality of any industrialized country over the last few decades here. In fact, and I promise, I think this is the last number I'll share with you, but the top 1% in this country owns 40% of the wealth of the country, the top 1%. But that's not as mind-boggling to me as the fact that the bottom 80% of this country owns just 7% of the wealth. 80% of this country owns just 7% of the wealth in the country. This is what we're dealing with. And someone talked about stocks or mutual funds or something earlier in the day. And I thought to myself, you know, we talk about wealth and owning wealth a lot in terms of who owns stock or who doesn't. The truth is that 1% owns 50% of the stocks and bonds in this country, right? The rest of us, I think, what is the number? Actually, yes, 50%. 50% of people in this country own less than 1% of the stocks in the country, and that probably includes many of us in this room. So 0.5% of all the stocks, mutual bonds, mutual funds bonds owned are owned by 50% of the country, which probably explains why nobody really understands what's going on in the financial market. In any case, the thing is that poverty has been exacerbated by the shift that Bhumika talked about from a real economy to a financial economy, and by neoliberal economic policies. And what are we talking about? It's things we hear in the news every day. It's this idea that the market rules, that the free market rules, and that all problems can be solved if you leave the market, the private sector, to do its thing, if you leave businesses who are in the business to make a profit, to provide public goods. And that's a prevailing idea we have. And so what goes along with that? That we should not regulate them. We should leave the market to be as free as it can be of regulation so that it can flourish. The idea of privatization, that private companies are better suited to provide public services, and hence we see that in the shift, like things like education, the move, even to charter schools and to online education services, vouchers. Okay, you're making me nervous when you move. I don't know. am I up?
You're fine.
Wonderful. The public housing is also being privatized. So we see that shift in so many different sectors. In Detroit, almost everything, every public service and good has been privatized, even the delivery of water. So that's another aspect of neoliberal economic policies. And I'm explaining these things because I needed the explanation. I needed the breakdown myself to fully understand what we're talking about. But I think the most harmful part of it is also this associated idea that we should cut public services. Because it's this idea that it's really a way to destroy the concept of the public good, of collective rights, that we can all pull ourselves up by our bootstraps as individuals. It's individual responsibility. And if you're not doing well in society, it's because you've done something wrong. And almost every conversation in the United States that we've talked about that has to do with cutting public services, the underlying idea is that the people who are generally receiving public services are undeserving. And while it's not said out loud, we really were generally thinking about people of color and women. People who, as the story goes, are not working hard enough for what they get. So I just want to make that connection also, that with poverty, we're talking a lot about race and gender as well. So that's the first thing, this rise of this dominance of neoliberal economic policies, which has exacerbated poverty and inequality over the last few decades. And then the state's response to rising poverty has been to criminalize it. So we see that in a number of different areas, including with migrants, which is why it came up, where you criminalize practically the very existence of immigrants who don't happen to have the right documents. Increasingly around the country, we see policies that criminalize poverty in different ways, that criminalize the homeless. They criminalize panhandling. There was a story about I just saw a video of a homeless guy, who kept getting tickets for panhandling, and the only way he could get the money to pay for them is to panhandle. So, but it's in New York City, you can be arrested for sleeping in a park. Guess who gets targeted for sleeping in a park? So we're criminalizing the fact that people are homeless instead of really thinking through root causes and providing services for people who really need them. So that's the second thing when it comes to our response. And then, of course, the third response, which really is always exciting to me, is this real recognition that we need to build a movement to realize human rights. And it was talked about earlier today. The truth is, we do have a human rights movement in the United States. We've had one, and it's growing. Like I said, the U.S. Human Rights Network is 10 years old. The network itself was created by activists in the United States doing domestic human rights work, primarily feminists of color, I might add, some of them in this room. But the idea came up from domestic human rights groups who realized that we need a space in the United States to start talking to each other, learning from each other, and building our collective voice and power. So that movement is growing. Hasn't grown as fast as some of us would like, but I can tell you in the 10 to 12 years that I've been doing this work, it's grown exponentially, much more than I ever would have imagined. And that's what the network is here to do, is really, we're over 300 members strong now, organizational members, and quite frankly, we have over 3,000 individual members, and that's remarkable given that we were actually set up as a network for organizational members, not individuals. The individual members happened by accident, of people just coming and signing up and feeling like we want to do something, we want to belong to this collective movement. I think that's very important because we all know that power concedes nothing without a demand, right? And what we are trying to do at the network is really create spaces for groups, for different movements to come together, to build collective power, learn from each other. We're seeing that happen. We've seen that happen without the human rights frame. We've seen that happen with the labor movement, the LGBT movement, the racial justice movement, all coming together. I think what we really need is a unifying frame so that we're all talking the same language, and human rights accommodates all our movements, as Charlotte had mentioned earlier in her comments. So that's essentially what the U.S. Human Rights Network is doing. And we see that as an essential way to tackle poverty and inequality. And what's exciting is that a lot of our most active membership is at the grassroots level. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that are happening that I think are exciting. How many of you have heard about Take Back the Land? Okay, great. So Take Back the Land is really a movement that was initially housed, I should say, at the network, but it's really activists who came together as a result of the housing crisis, and were sick and tired of the fact that there were all these legal constraints on accessing housing, and in so many cases there would be homes that lay vacant, owned by the government, sometimes owned by banks, and just laying fallow, used for nothing. At the same time, you would have a homeless family, maybe even right outside. So what did they start to do? They started identifying those vacant homes and taking them over and moving families into them. And so what it forced is this question, and I think this is an important question when we think about human rights in this country. It was breaking the law to go in and house families in those vacant homes. But if you think about the human right to housing, like, who has the higher moral ground? You'd rather have a family homeless on the streets right next to a vacant house that's doing nothing? So so for us, that trend towards civil disobedience, direct action from some of our grassroots members is really exciting. And you see it in so many different circles. We saw it from the Dreamers, right? People who are risking arrest and really a lot in their future by taking a human rights stand. And we've seen it also more recently in what started in North Carolina called the Moral Mondays, where every Monday people would go up to the State House and acts of civil disobedience to protest a whole host of conservative laws that, in this case, the Republicans were trying to pass. I think that what we need to do as a network and as a collective movement is to support these kinds of actions where they happen. They happen at the grassroots. Increasingly, they're not happening. They're not led by any one organization. They're led by individual community leaders. So we need to find ways to support them so that we can build our collective voice and power. And I guess the last thing I would say in that respect is that young people have been the ones that showed the way in this new new resurgence of civil disobedience. Quite frankly, a lot of that started to gain a lot of popular attention after Occupy. It didn't start with Occupy, don't get me wrong, but it started to gain a lot more popularity after Occupy. And I think that one of the things that we need to see more of in this country is really the excitement, the energy, the infusion of creativity that comes when youth are leading movements. So I'm really hoping that we see more of that moving forward. And my last self-serving statement will be that one way you can do it is to join the U.S. Human Rights Network. I thank you.
Thank you, Ajim, for that really poignant, those really poignant remarks. And I think that there's a red thread which is running through this symposium, and that has to do with our critique of neoliberalism and our pointing out that neoliberal policies have not been working for the majority of the world's people, including the majority of Americans, and the profound need to really rethink what we mean by growth and what policies are best for economic growth, and what policies are best not for economic growth in and of itself, but economic growth as it will promote the realization of human rights. because after all, what's the point of growth if people are not able to access water, healthcare, education, etc.? I also thought it was very interesting in your presentation, linking the ways in which we talk about the people who are not deserving, the narratives around those who are deserving and not deserving, and the ways in which the state will then act with generosity towards some and not others. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ignacio Saiz. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, an international NGO that was founded around the time of the Vienna World Conference to work for the recognition and enforcement of economic, social, and cultural rights worldwide. Ignacio is going to speak about the significance of the Vienna anniversary for economic and social rights.
Thank you very much, Savi. It's a delight to be here. As you say, we're celebrating a double anniversary. We're marking the 20th anniversary of the Vienna World Conference, which was so important for economic, social, and cultural rights, but we're also marking our 20th birthday. Happy birthday, AGIM, for the 10th birthday of the US network. So this twin anniversary for us has been a prompt for us to reflect on what progress we've made in advancing the economic and social rights dimensions of the Vienna agenda. As has been said this morning, Vienna was really a watershed for these rights, for economic and social and cultural rights, which are recognized in the Declaration of Rights of an equal standing with civil and political rights and indivisible and interdependent from them. The language is very unequivocal. The international community must treat all human rights globally in a fair and equal manner on the same footing and with the same emphasis. And as was said this morning, this was really significant because during the Cold War, ESC rights had been seen very much as second-class rights, vague aspirations rather than enforceable entitlements. In fact, the phrase fundamental rights, which is in the title of this event, has often been used to refer primarily to civil and political rights at the exclusion of economic, social, and cultural. And I think the Vienna Declaration, one of the great things it did was bring down that Berlin Wall between the two so-called categories of rights, and it signaled an end to their comparative marginalization. As was said this morning as well, Vienna was also a defining moment in terms of the relationship between human rights, in articulating the relationship between human rights and poverty. It was probably the first time that a human rights document recognized extreme poverty and social exclusion as constituting a violation of human dignity. And it called for a more mutually reinforcing relationship between human rights and development efforts. And significantly, it stressed the obligation of all states to work together to create an equitable and favorable economic environment at the international level, which would be conducive to not just to lasting development, but to the realization of human rights. And as this morning's panel stressed, Vienna was important in recognizing that the human rights framework needed to be made more responsive to the experience of women, but also other groups facing systemic discrimination, such as indigenous people, people with disabilities, migrants, who had really been, whose protections were really not, whose experience was not really reflected in practice in the way the human rights architecture was implemented. So CSR, in a sense, was founded with the mission of pursuing these three elements of the Vienna agenda. Vienna, for us, was a stimulus to work to expose and build evidence of violations of economic, social, and cultural rights, to hold those responsible to account, to work with marginalized and excluded communities to claim and actually enforce their rights, and to push for a better integration of human rights and development efforts. So 20 years on, what progress can we claim to have seen in this regard? On the first issue of the recognition and protection of economic, social, and cultural rights as fundamental rights, there have been important steps forward, at least at the normative level and at the level of the creation of a protective infrastructure. And one of the most significant milestones in that regard occurred earlier this year in May, when a new complaints mechanism under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights finally entered into force. This is something that advocates have been pushing for decades, and it represents a crucial step forward for economic, social and cultural rights, because it allows individuals and groups whose rights have been violated to file a complaint before the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights if their own government has failed to provide an effective remedy. Why is that so important? One more complaints mechanism. Well, it sends a really important message to governments that they really must ensure access to justice for socioeconomic deprivations, not just for violations of civil and political rights. And in many ways, it's the final nail in the coffin for the argument that these rights cannot be subject to adjudication or legal enforcement. But it's sobering to note that an equivalent mechanism has been in place under the Civil and Political Rights Covenant for nearly 40 years. So that underscores how long it's taken to really place economic, social and cultural rights on an equal footing at an international level. And of course, this mechanism is only available to people in countries which have ratified the covenant and the optional protocol. And sad to say, the US has not ratified. It's one of the few countries that has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, along with Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, a few other strange bedfellows. And at the national level also, economic, social and cultural rights guarantees have been increasingly incorporated into international constitutions and national legal frameworks. In many countries, these guarantees have been invoked and have been applied to secure, for example, access to antiretroviral treatments in the case of South Africa, to challenge and prevent starvation deaths in India, and to challenge unfair health budget cuts, as in Colombia. These are all the result of constitutional claims brought as a result of the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights in these countries' constitutions. And these decisions can be literally life-saving. A recent study of the impact of legal accountability mechanisms in 5 countries estimated that the judicial enforcement of economic, social, and cultural rights may well have averted tens of thousands of deaths and likely enriched the lives of millions of others. But where does this get us? I mean, is primarily the progress that we have seen since Vienna is primarily at this level of the infrastructure of human rights protection. A central paradox since Vienna, to borrow Anita's language of the paradoxical moment that we're in, a central paradox is that while the last 20 years have seen the construction of a far stronger architecture of institutional protection of ESC rights at the global and at the national levels, over the same period, the dominant economic policies pursued by most governments and pushed by international institutions have eroded the capacity and the willingness of states to fulfill their economic and social rights obligations. Trends such as the financialization of the economy that Bhumika spoke so eloquently about, intensified processes of trade liberalization, and now the dominant worldwide wave of fiscal austerity. These are really eroding the capacity of states to be able to honor the commitments that they have under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So really, the real measure of progress shouldn't just be the increase in mechanisms, the fact that there are new special rapporteurs that work on economic, social, and cultural rights. The real benchmark of progress should be the extent to which people are actually enjoying their basic economic and social rights in practice and are able to claim these rights and enforce these rights and demand a remedy when these rights are violated. And in many respects, what we're seeing is a deterioration over the last 20 years, particularly in the wake of the global economic crisis. Our organization has done a lot of work looking at the impacts worldwide of what we call the various waves of the crisis. First of all, the immediate impact on escalating unemployment, on school dropouts, more limited access to health of the first wave of the financial crisis, but more recently looking at the impacts of fiscal austerity measures. The prevailing dogma of austerity has given renewed force, as I think Bhumika said, to efforts to replace a socially protective state with the notion of market-led social service provision. And it's clear, the fact that the fiscal austerity dogma is being applied even in situations which are not facing, in countries which are not facing the acute problems of balancing fiscal deficits, as in Southern Europe, shows that there's an ideological drive behind it. It's giving renewed impetus to an agenda, the so-called Washington Consensus agenda that we thought we thought we'd moved on, while the window of opportunity, while the crisis created a window of opportunity to challenge the dominant school of neoclassical economic thought, this thinking still retains, I believe, retains an even stronger grip now on many governments and key institutions of economic governance. So the key challenge now is how to use this consolidated infrastructure of institutional protection of economic, social, and cultural rights to really challenge some of these policies that are driving poverty and deprivation. How to make human rights principles really become guiders and shapers of areas of policy which are currently rights-free zones, macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy. And this is a central challenge that we've been dealing with. In Spain, for example, one of the countries most affected in Southern Europe by the austerity dogma, we felt that legal avenues were closed to us to be able to challenge some of the very harmful impacts, such as the decision to, as a result of budgetary cutbacks, to deny undocumented migrants access to basic health care, even in emergency situations. The legal avenues are reduced by the fact that the Spanish Constitution, for example, relegates to second category status economic and social and cultural rights, with only one exception, the right to education, being justiciable. And so we have had to have recourse to international bodies such as the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was reviewing Spain's record last year, together with a coalition of organizations, of 20 organizations and social movements in Spain. We built the evidence of the human rights impact of austerity measures in Spain. I think we built it very convincingly. I'm sorry. I was saying how, together with a coalition of 20 organizations and social movements in Spain, we attempted to build evidence in a shadow report of the human rights impacts of austerity measures. We took this to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which issued a very strong recommendation to Spain and pronouncement to all states on the issue of non-retrogression, the principle that there can be no deliberate backsliding in economic, social and cultural rights, and that the maximum of available resources must be generated and deployed to prevent any such backsliding. But where has this got us? I mean, we felt it was a compelling victory, but we've taken it back home, and decision makers are, simply not interested in what a Geneva-based human rights expert body has to say. They're not interested in what Geneva was saying, they're interested in what's coming from Berlin and from Brussels. And so for us, it was really a question of making this recommendation something that can form the basis of a platform for social movement and civil society advocacy. And we're pleased to say that 1 year on, there is a vibrant movement now in Spain which is trying to monitor and trying to advocate for the implementation of this recommendation. But I use it as an illustration of the need to go beyond simply measuring progress at the level of infrastructure and to look at how we translate this normative consolidation into practice. I want to just say a couple of words as well about the question of the convergence between human rights and development agendas and where we are 20 years on from that. This is a good vantage point for looking at this question because many of us have spent much of last week lobbying around the General Assembly, where one of the key issues on the agenda was what should replace the Millennium Development Goals in post-2015. I mean, if we look at the MDG process in itself as an indication of how far we've come in marrying human rights and development, I think we would say we're in a very sorry state after 20 years of supposedly human rights-based approaches to development. As we all know, the MDGs did a disservice to human rights because they the goals undercut human rights provisions in very important ways. Perhaps the biggest glaring cross-cutting deficiency was their blindness to questions of inequality, which created perverse incentives to many states to actually meet aggregate targets, widening socioeconomic and gender and other disparities. The results really of the MDGs are unimpressive. We will hear over the next 2 years, we will hear trumpeted many of the successes, the poverty target having been met, etc. But if the poverty target has been met, it's almost entirely due to one country, China, which dropped its poverty rate from 60% in 1990 to 16% in 2005, but as a result of policies that are not attributable to the MDGs, i.e. it would have happened anyway. So, what is there to trumpet? In sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in 2 people continue to live in extreme poverty. At this rate, Africa will achieve the MDG poverty target in 2076. More than 1 billion people still live in extreme poverty, women making up 70%. So, despite the undoubted trumpeting that there will be at the UN in a couple of years' time, in 2015, we need to be clear that the MDGs have really not had impressive results. There have been, over the last 20 years, there has been an evolution in the discourse around the marriage of human rights and development. That's undeniable. Since 2003, UN agencies have been adopting, have supposedly been implementing what's called a common understanding on a rights-based approach, by which they committed themselves to integrating human rights in all development cooperation programs. Many governments now claim that they've been adopting a rights-based approach to development. For example, Denmark's development cooperation strategy, I heard last week, is called the Right to a Better Life, and its stated goal is to fight poverty with human rights and economic growth. And human rights is described as the backbone of the strategy. There have also been important normative developments with regard to the marriage of human rights and development. And one instrument that very rarely gets invoked in these debates around the future development agenda are the guiding principles on extreme poverty and human rights, which were adopted by the Human Rights Council last year. And this is a powerful instrument. They're guiding principles. They don't have the force of a binding treaty, but they make an important point that poverty has to be understood not narrowly in terms of GDP growth, but in terms of the many dimensions of human well-being that are covered in the human rights framework. And so they contain in one document, in one instrument, the whole range of rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, that come into play in terms of eradication of poverty. Many of us in the human rights community were delighted last week at the outcome of the General Assembly, that the outcome document reaffirms the importance of promoting human rights, good governance, rule of law, transparency, and accountability at all levels in the post-2015 agenda. However, this is scant progress considering 20 years of lip service to truly integrating human rights and development approaches. There are still indications that this commitment is definitely more rhetorical than real. There's a very real risk that in this process human rights will be at best a preambular statement that will not be run through the framing of goals, the identification of targets, how indicators are identified to measure progress. States are still extremely reluctant to accept that eradicating poverty is a matter of legal obligation for which they will be held accountable. And yes, many southern states of the South are wary of the fact that human rights will be invoked as an instrument of aid conditionality. But, as I think Radhika said this morning, they have good reason to feel this way because the real duplicity around human rights has been at the level of industrialized countries. The biggest shortfalls in accountability in the MDG process so far has been the failure of industrialized countries to honor their commitments, the commitments that they made to the Global Partnership for Development under current MDG 8. These were the least quantified and the most vaguely articulated. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to flag the key issues that we and many civil society groups are pressing for in the post-2015 context, which we feel are critical for advancing the Vienna agenda and for revitalizing the Vienna agenda. And I can only simply bullet point them without expanding them because I have one minute left. The post-2015 context is an opportunity, for the reason I've just said, to push for more effective ways of holding governments to their extraterritorial obligations. This was a concept Radhika mentioned this morning. Basically, it means duties to respect, protect, and help fulfill rights beyond borders. There's now a robust framework, at least in legal scholarship and advocacy, which is beginning to be applied by certain international human rights bodies in the sphere of development obligations, but this is very politically contested. If we're looking to set new horizons for the human rights agenda, the concept of extraterritorial obligations, applying them in concrete situations to hold specific governments accountable for their human rights impacts abroad. This is a critical front of struggle for the next 20 years. And similarly, reinforcing, as has been said amply by others, strengthening mechanisms for corporate accountability is also vital. We are very concerned about the hijacking. I think it was Charlotte talked about the accusation of hijacking of Vienna by the women's rights movement. A real hijacking is taking place of the post-2015 agenda by powerful corporate interests. And this hijacking is perhaps much more sophisticated than the hijacking that you were referring to before, because it's actually co-opting the language. It comes with a very slick discourse, and this is something that we must really guard against. I haven't had time here to talk about how the inequality agenda in particular can be taken forward. But my one point there was to reinforce a point that has been made by several speakers around the need for this development agenda to include income inequality and the reduction of income inequality as a set of firm commitments, not just in this country where concentration of wealth is at its greatest since the Great Depression, but the figure that you gave, Ajim, for the US replicates globally 0.6%. The top 0.6% of the global adult population controls just under 40%, 39.6% of the wealth. And the trend has widened. That's the most severe indictment of our inability to make economic, social, and cultural rights real and to really integrate human rights and development practice. And therefore, this must be seized as an opportunity to redress income inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio, for reminding us that the real benchmark of progress is the extent to which people are able to realize their economic, social, and cultural rights. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. We can take a series of questions. If you can, we've got microphones at the back, so if you can, but we'll have Rosa.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Rosa Lizardi with the Feminist Task Force. And first of all, thank you very much for the presentations, not only these, but earlier. I think it's been a very valuable engagement, especially in light of what's been happening across the big river, the Hudson, over at the UN around development and migration, and also around the post-2015 dialogue. And I think what I'm taking away from this right now is the fact that, we are struggling to ensure that within the post-2015 development agenda, human rights is at its core. And there's very little reference to Vienna plus 20. Aside from us being here, we're not really hearing it across the river. And so I'm wanting to ask, how can we really build these social movements and build the efforts that are talking about not only, climate change and macroeconomic policy restructuring and development, the right to development, and really incorporate that issue of human rights, because we know that the governments don't want to deal with it, and civil society and everyone is saying we need to ensure that it's there. And also on the issue of the private sector. Patricia Guerrero was just whispering in my ear while you were talking, Ignacio. She was saying, I don't believe anything they're saying. This was after the comment about how the private sector and corporations are co-opting the agenda. I think that that is a very serious issue that we have to really confront. I mean, we have to confront it with the issue of basic human rights, but when governments are not wanting to talk about that, how can we do it? That's a big question I leave with you all. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm a freshman this year, so I guess from my perspective, I'm thinking about how in high school or when I was in middle school, I didn't really pay attention to any of these, issues at all, because I just wasn't informed, especially where I grew up. Or I don't feel like that many people in our generation really know how important this is. So how are you, if you are getting the word out to, younger generations who are actually going to be, having an impact in the near future over, our lives?
When I first heard of the seminar, I could completely relate to Vienna because a lot of the times we see that there's a lot of political corruption going on internationally. Like from where I personally related was from India, in Delhi, 1984 riots. So how can we unite? What are some methods that we can use to unite people, and what are some ways that we can use? What are some ideas for how we can spread the message out and come up with ways to integrate this into our school curricula? Because I think it's important that this is integrated into our school curriculum, the human rights, because these are real people that are being affected by injustices of the human government, and as citizens of the United States, I feel that it is our duty to come up with ways to help others and integrate these human rights. So what can we do to make college students more informed about this and to create more social movements so that people can fight the slick government agenda, the slick corporate, the way their cunningness and their guileness?
Buenas tardes. Marta Benavides, El Salvador, and we are with the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. One of the concerns that I have that we haven't really been discussing here, but is very urgent, is not only how human rights and the economic, social, and cultural rights of people, are two sets, in a sense, of, frameworks that we have to work with. For us in the Global South, we know that if there is not economic, social, and cultural rights of people and also the rights to a healthy environment, there is no human rights. And often we are talking about saving the planet, when the planet is going to save itself from us because we are not creating the conditions. And the planet is in peril. We are in peril. And so, for us it's very important to talk about the production and consumption patterns of the North. That is the key thing. And also forever, when the time I was growing up, we were always in our countries in the South talking about human rights framework instead of the political, social, and the political and civil rights that were in the Constitution, because that could change any time that a coup d'etat was sponsored in our countries. So this history has to be known by the people of the North, and this is the call I'm bringing, because at this point, the UN is saying the post-New Development Agenda, post-2015, and they're talking about 2030. 2030 is gone already. And that's why it's important for the young people, especially of this country, to really go and see what's happening in other countries, not to help us, because we don't need any help. What we need is you to really do your work here so that we can work together. And that's why, for me, it's very important to talk about this. This is the question for me, because what Bhumika was talking about, that's what we talk about all the time. Even, the person that sells, things in the streets can tell you about it. In my country, prostitutes are talking about this. So I am asking, when are we going to address the problem? Because the problem is right here, in the industrialized nations. It's not the First Nations, it's not developed nations, and we don't even want to be developing nations, and we are not banana republics either. So here, we haven't addressed the whole thing about the shutdown.
Yes, Marta, my partner, in this historical fight of the last 20 years, she's going to translate my question, because it's very complicated for my broken English. Okay. No, la situación es que en este momento ni siquiera podemos producir semillas en Colombia.
She's talking from Colombia, and she's saying, at this moment, the critical thing is that we cannot even have our own seeds.
No podemos tener nuestras propias semillas que tradicionalmente hemos tenido para cultivar la tierra, porque ahora esas semillas están en manos de una multinacional que se llama Monsanto. Ni siquiera tenemos maíz.
So the problem is that the traditional seeds that we have always had for our very basic staples, we cannot even produce them so that we can do our own growth and cultivation, because this is in the hands of a transnational corporation that is called Monsanto.
Sí, entonces Monsanto también ha sido la multinacional que ha hecho las aspersiones aéreas para la fumigación de la guerra contra las drogas.
And Monsanto is the one that is behind, providing whatever is needed to fumigate in our country, in Colombia, against the people because of the war on drugs.
Entonces, lo único que crece a donde ha sido fumigado por Monsantos es lo que Monsantos tiene como sus propias semillas.
So the only thing that really can grow in the areas that is being fumigated by Monsanto is the seeds that they can grow there.
Y ustedes pueden mirar que ese proceso de fumigación, de despojo de tierra, y de todo este proceso no es una cosa aislada.
So we have to see that this whole process of, fumigation and taking the land is not an issue that is isolated from other issues.
Los 6 millones de personas desplazadas en Colombia tienen que ver con este control multinacional de la tierra.
So the 6 million people that are displaced inside of Colombia have to do with this taking over of the land, international taking over of the land.
Y después inician un proceso donde van a reparar a las víctimas con centavos. La tierra que le quitaron, la reparación de sus vidas, las violaciones que sufrieron las mujeres, que han sido históricamente despojadas de la tierra, ahora la van a hacer con una ley de reparación mínima, limosna.
So after all this land is taken away by it's an international, global campaign in a sense, that is going to be resolved in Colombia supposedly by having a law that is going to pay cents to the people whose lands have been taken away after they have suffered displacement, murders, imprisonment, disappearances, and the impoverishment. And it's mostly the women who have lost the land.
Entonces, por eso, Ignacio, es difícil creer en que todo este proceso de cooptación de la economía, de cooptación del Estado, de cooptación de los mismos procesos de paz, tienen que ver con los derechos humanos. No creo que tengan que ver con los derechos humanos, creo que tienen que ver con un despojo sistemático, organizado y militarista de la gente pobre, de la que tiene la tierra.
So that's why I was saying that I cannot believe that this whole process, in terms of the development agenda, really have to do with human rights, because it's really based on a process of militarization and taking over the land, and that where there is no respect for human rights. So that's basically what I was saying, that I cannot believe that really is a framework for human rights.
Quiero explicar un poco esto que quedó como confuso, que no tiene que ver con los derechos humanos. Claro, tiene que ver con los derechos humanos, pero es que hay un proceso de redefinición, por decirlo, transnacional de los derechos humanos. O sea, los derechos humanos es como lo que las transnacionales necesitan de la gente, no es la interpretación de la civil society. No somos nosotras aquí sentados, son las multinacionales y las transnacionales que negocian con los estados, con los presidentes, que son los mismos propietarios del sistema económico.
And just to clarify, because you might think that I don't believe in human rights and and that human rights don't exist, what I'm saying is that there is an international redefinition of human rights that is happening with the big transnationals and other companies and the presidents of our countries that usually are the owners of the land anyway.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions and we'll move to the panel.
Hi, so is this on? Close? Okay. I was just wondering how you're going to get the youth involved, because I am a part of the youth community and I'm involved in the studies in this movement. However, the majority of youth don't know that this exists. So we touched on curriculum being changed, but like schools are not just going to change their curriculum because they're very set in their ways. There's I know in New Jersey there are more school municipalities than there are actual municipalities. So it's really difficult to change over 600 school districts in one state, let alone an entire nation. So should extra institutions that are public be built that maybe are surrounded around community versus school districts, maybe surrounded around counties, something larger than that can bring people together, versus having each teacher teach it differently to different students every single year and just have a collective of students learn the facts and not have it misconstrued. And also, talking about policies, it's really difficult to change policies. And I was wondering, for all of these human rights institutions, are they also lobbying politicians? Because corporations are lobbying hardcore. They have a lot of money to do it. And what are human rights institutions doing to lobby as well?
Hi, good afternoon. This question is for Bhumika. You mentioned the issue of food security, and I was wondering if you had any opinion on the recent legislation that was signed in India on the food security bill. So just wondering if you could expand on that, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you for these questions. We are running over time. I think if we can take 5 minutes to answer these questions, which I know is not going to give you enough time to do justice to the questions, and then we move into the break to begin the next session at 3:15. Shall we begin with Bhumika and work our way down? Yes?
Okay. Let's see. I'm going to try to select a few of the questions that I feel particularly attached to. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Sort of, yeah. So I think this question of how do we get the youth and students involved came up a few times. I am myself a veteran of the United Students Against Sweatshops. When I was an undergrad, I was a student labor activist. I went to the Seattle WTO protests. That's when I got involved, when I heard Vandana Shiva speak, when I heard Martin Kaur speak, who is now one of my mentors. So it's fantastic in the way that trajectories can develop this way just by getting involved. After I graduated undergrad, I became the national organizer for USAS nationally. And I grew up in Indonesia. I went back to Indonesia, did research in the sweatshop, in the export processing zones, came back to the U.S. universities and did campus tours. My experience was that campus tours are still profound in terms of making the endeavor to bring people from the South to different university campuses, but to also take an active leadership role yourself. I know USAS is still going strong. I still have friends. I'm on the board. I, am still active in the student labor activist movement. I still support it wholeheartedly, mostly through Facebook these days. But, this is a model. What I'm bringing up USAS because it was the largest student movement after Students for a Democratic Society in Berkeley in the Vietnam War movement era. And this was the largest student activist movement, 200 plus campuses when I was an undergrad, which was a long time, 15 years ago. So, now it's more. So, we can look at this model and try to replicate it. How does USAS work? It works with chapters. They have annual conferences. Every year we met at a university. We brought together all the different chapters from all the different campuses. The model of USAS can work for these more complex issues. You can start with student tuition. You can start with youth unemployment, which Huffington Post just 3 days ago wrote a headline article titled, "Youth Unemployment is the Next Big World Crisis." It's a staggering number of youth around the world. In the US alone, the number of youth unemployment is increasing by 800,000, 600,000 every year. And this is a massive issue. As you guys know, student debt, student tuition, all of that. And I want to also highlight Occupy Strike Jubilee. Strike Jubilee is Occupy's specific campaign on student tuition and student debt. Second, I wanted to, I think the food security bill in India question I can answer privately to you. My organization is working very heavily on this with India's proposal in the World Trade Organization. Essentially, the quick story is that India made a very strong proposal in the World Trade Organization for a food security bill for developing countries. India is arguing that developing countries should be able to give temporary price support to farmers, meaning the farmers that are suffering the most, they should be able to buy the goods from the farmers at below market rates to help farmers out. The developed countries, especially the US, Canada, and the EU, the Juice Cans group, is looking at it as a subsidy. They're putting it in the subsidy box, saying this is not allowed under WTO rules because this food subsidy bill would be viewed as a subsidy. Meanwhile, let us be reminded that the United States and the European Union gives out vast amounts of subsidies for decades to its own farmers. So this is a profound example of the sheer hypocrisy that disempowers and impoverishes vast swaths of people in the global South. We cannot talk about a post-2015 development agenda, and I'm sorry to say we cannot talk about human rights without addressing these binding structural rules in the WTO, in the IMF, in the G20. And last, I just want to end with a private sector co-optation. We need to also look at the G20. The G20 has aggressively amplified its mandate. Its most recent communique with the Russian presidency, April 2013, states that the G20 is seeking to modify mandates of national and international development banks with the goal of promoting investment and directing focus primarily in infrastructure development, particularly through public-private partnerships. So let's look at the fact that this is the G20's wording in its communique. Now we see the reflection in the post-2015 development agenda. The post-2015 development agenda is not only being hijacked by the G20 and the World Bank, but it is also a vehicle to legitimize the private sector's role in development, to aggressively legitimize a blueprint for the private sector role in development. I have looked back at some of the communiques and summaries of the Global Compact board meetings. They even talk about legal powers for the firms in PPPs. Up so far, the PPPs are riddled with problems, especially in terms of debt, in terms of who pays the risk. If the project goes bust, the state usually pays for it. But to enshrine public-private partnerships within legal frameworks, this is a whole scary step. So when we talk about the UN and post-2015 and human rights principles, we need to directly locate it in the structural obstacles that have for decades cut the arms and legs of true right to development paths.
On Rosa's question about how can we make the Vienna plus 20, how can we... Okay, I'm sorry. On Rosa's question about how can Vienna plus 20 be heard across the river, I mean, I feel a bit like Antonio Romero this morning, that the Vienna is not, the Vienna Declaration, it's not about trumpeting it and making sure people, and citing it and making sure people cite it in the post-2015 agenda. I don't expect that. Vienna is more a prompt for introspection amongst those of us engaged, I think, in human rights and social justice, because it was a landmark, it was a watershed, and we're celebrating its anniversary. It's a bit like a birthday, you mark a birthday because it's useful for thinking about where to go in future. But I don't think of it as an instrument that needs to be continually cited. But what does need to be brought into these to ongoing struggles and debates is the spirit of Vienna and the key gains of Vienna. So the recognition that human beings are at the center of development, that the realization of human rights is the very purpose of development. That's a Vienna principle. The indivisibility principle. You can't have a set of development commitments that trade-off between one aspect of human dignity and another aspect of human dignity. And thirdly, I think the key Vienna spirit for me, and Charlotte alluded to this morning, is how the belief, the notion that the human rights framework is not something static and fixed and monolithic. It evolves, and it evolves to respond to our claims as human beings, and our own sense of injustice, and to the inclusion of excluded voices and excluded experiences. And that we're at that transformative moment again, I think, for human rights, whether it's in the field of whether we're interfacing with development or with other issues. We need that transformative vision again in human rights. On the question of corporate, how do we confront the co-optation of the agenda by business? Two things. I mean, for 40 years now, there have been attempts to create binding human rights norms applicable to businesses, to rein in this unbridled, power of transnational corporations, which we've seen both in the Monsanto case, in countless examples across the globe. Those efforts have been thwarted themselves by the private sector, which has always wanted to restrict the binding nature or limit the binding nature of these norms, and at best we have a whole set of proliferation of voluntary self-regulatory mechanisms which have been shown to be weak and toothless precisely because they do not exert real accountability, they do not provide remedy to communities and individuals affected by the harmful aspects of corporate operations. So there is a renewed impetus now, and in the post-2015 debates, I hear this, and I see this coming up again. There's a renewed impetus to push again for some kind of body of international legal norms. In fact, the government of Ecuador just a couple of weeks ago introduced an initiative at the Human Rights Council signaling an attempt to restart or to reissue the attempt to create some set of binding human rights norms applicable to transnational corporations. So that's something that I think we need to put some effort behind and see how we can overcome some of the strategic pitfalls of the last attempt. And on Patricia's specific point, I'm not sure that we're in disagreement. Because I wasn't saying that the co-optation by business is a good thing. I was alerting to the danger of the language of human rights being co-opted in this way, so I don't think that we're arguing against each other. The last thing, universal framework. I've forgotten who made this point. It was Marta herself, in fact, on the real issue is around production and consumption patterns in the north, and how dealing with the real problems here rather than seeing problems as being abroad. This is precisely why the next development, the set of development commitments, needs to be truly universal, just as it needs to address the injustices and the rights and injustices faced by people in the US as much as in any other part of the world. So it needs to address the responsibilities of all governments. And that's something that the current NDG framework didn't do. And that's why this debate is so much more delicate. And that's why northern governments are resisting. But we absolutely have to push for a framework of commitments that includes tangible, quantifiable commitments for governments of the North, precisely for issues such as consumption patterns and a whole host of issues that are fueling poverty and environmental degradation worldwide.
So I'd like to answer the question. Someone asked whether human rights groups were lobbying governments. And I thought I'd take that one on and say that, yes, in fact, human rights organizations are lobbying governments, certainly within the UN system, lobbying governments, but also I think the question was more specifically within countries, lobbying governments. The problem is that we're outmatched 1,000 times by the private sector. So it always comes back to corporate power. And not only are we outmatched in terms of resources, also the way NGOs, the tax status of NGOs most NGOs are created here is that you're limited in the kind of lobbying, in any lobbying that you can do. So a lot of foundations will give you money with stipulations, specific stipulations that you not lobby. So in fact, one of the primary tactics that advocates have at their hands, they're limited in doing. So it's a double whammy, if you will. And I think this question of really the hijacking, co-optation of the democratic system, the so-called democratic system that we have in this country by an economic elite is something that we need to tackle and talk about. And figure out a way to address. And I wish I had the answers. I don't have them. On the second question about, again, like revolving around how we build a movement, how we involve the youth, I think Bhumika's suggestions were right on. I would also say, and something that struck me is that oftentimes I feel that we're having two separate conversations. We have to figure out how to popularize human rights and expand it outside of our circles. Because I find that a lot of the language we use, when I use with other people in my family who are not in this field, they don't quite get. So in many ways, if we're not speaking the language that people outside of our circles are speaking, we don't have an opportunity to bring on likely allies, people who actually agree with us, but are just not steeped in the language that we're using. So I think we really need to think about how we communicate with people in order to reach and inform people outside our immediate circles. Not everyone is going to go and take that extra step to find out information. So we have to figure out ways of reaching people easily. And then the other thing is, there seem to be tactics that have worked that I feel we're not using as much as we probably could. We work with the sweatshops with the focus on a single company like Nike. The Coalition for Immokalee Workers here in Florida have used it successfully, going after one company, first Taco Bell, then company after company, and engaging students in that effort, boycotting companies, hitting them where it hurts them the most. So I think that the tactics that have worked, that can help us build a larger movement, tackle corporate power in very limited ways, no doubt, and involve the youth, that we should think about expanding and using more. We don't have too many tactics that I see on a day-to-day basis that work effectively. The ones that do, we should really think about using. And then the last thing, and I almost hesitate to say this, but it really is important, and we have to figure out a way of using our social media, YouTube videos, like different ways of communicating than, I'll say older, not old, but older fuddy-duddies like me are not used to using, because that's the way people communicate. They say the largest search engine now for youth is YouTube. So we really need to think about, if we're trying to engage with youth, then we really need to think about using media that they use. Thanks.
Thank you. For the Rutgers students, I'd like to give a shout out to Douglas College and their Human Rights House. So for those of you who are not aware that the Human Rights House exists, please, there are several people, many people here actually, who are from Douglas College, who'd be happy to share information about it with you. So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists. And we'll reconvene in 10 minutes.
Oh, and we have a conference in December. I have to take this advantage. I have flyers about a national human rights conference that we're having in Atlanta in December. It's going to be really exciting. We have incredible speakers, and there's already a lot of energy around it. So if you're interested, get a postcard. I'll leave them outside.